Good morning, everybody. I want to welcome everybody. I'm Neil Chase. I'm the CEO at CalMatters, and with me is Ben Christopher, who covers housing for us. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the recent changes in California housing law and how they affect people in California, and some stuff that we're going to be seeing on the ballot this year that folks are going to be able to vote on. But first, I thought I'll explain a little bit to you about what we're doing here. This is part of CalMatters for Learning. CalMatters for Learning is a project we're doing with our good friends at the California State Library, and they have enabled us to take the work that we do and make it available to libraries, schools, and other organizations for educational use, for seminars, for webinars, for in-person meetings, for resources for people who use the library. And you can see in the chat there, the CalMatters for Learning website. There's a slide deck about this and some other materials. There's learning materials for a handful of topics we've done over the past year. And we'll continue to do these once a month, every month from here out, with a big focus next year on the elections in January and February, leading up to the March primary, and then in August and September and October, leading up to the November election. So we hope you'll follow along with that and make use of those resources, especially if you're part of a library. Very grateful to the State Library for supporting this. Ben Christopher, I want to start with just a little bit of background on you. You are a born and raised Californian. Talk a little bit about your path from growing up in California to being now on the housing beat at CalMatters.
Sure. Well, hi, Neil. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, I am born and raised in California. I was born in Oakland. I spent a lot of my childhood in Santa Barbara and then back in the Bay Area. And I lived in the East Bay, where I live now in Oakland, for, oh God, I'm old, 10 years, 11 years, something like that.
So if
And
you're old, what does
so
that make me?
I'll leave that to you. But so yeah, I've been a reporter on and off for about a decade. I was a freelancer in the Bay Area. I decided that journalism was not for me. I wanted a real job with real career stability. And so I went and got a grad degree in public policy and then immediately came back to journalism. And so at CalMatters, I've been at CalMatters for 6 years, which makes me one of the longest reporters on staff, which is kind of horrifying. But speaking of age, but for most of that time, I was covering elections and politics. Although, housing in California is always sort of one of the most interesting political stories. And so I was very happy to come onto the housing beat earlier this year, where I've been catching up to speed and reporting on what's been a very interesting year in housing.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be fascinating to be a housing reporter anywhere in California, right? Especially if you live in the Bay Area. I mean, you can't go anywhere. You can't talk to anybody without something related to housing, homelessness, affordability. Where do you live? Why do you commute so far to work? All those kinds of things. That just it's what we all talk about, right? It's the top of mind thing for so many people in California. You couldn't avoid it even if you weren't the housing reporter.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it makes conversations at cocktail parties interesting because people always have an opinion whenever I mention what I do for a living. But no, I mean, one of the things that I really like about covering housing is that there's this, sometimes you hear this term, the housing theory of everything, which means that, whatever issue you look at in California, whatever sort of pressing public policy issue or pressing social issue in California, there's always a housing element to it, whether you're looking at poverty or inequality or access to education or climate change or traffic or transportation issues, sprawl. These are all housing stories, and so there's so many ways in which this is a very important issue, and so feel lucky to cover it.
Yeah, yeah. I see somebody, Cheryl put a note in the chat saying Santa Rosa, where she lives, is the eighth most expensive place to live in the US. And we have a lot of the most expensive housing markets around here for sure. And seeing that reminds me, if you have any questions, comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll get some questions toward the end, but we can also jump on some things in the middle if it's a good time to answer questions. And the idea of housing being related to everything, the thing you hear it mostly connected to is homelessness, right? Now, we have separate reporters on housing and homelessness. They are obviously related, but they're not the same thing, right? There's a distinction between all the different things you can do for someone who's homeless, including helping them find a place to live, and all the housing issues that some of whom serve people who are unhoused, and some of them are equally pressing for people who've been living in houses for a long time, right?
Yeah, so I think just this year, CalMatters decided to split the that beat. Once upon a time, there was just a general housing beat, which covered everything from homelessness to legislation to produce more housing to regulations on solar panels on roofs. It sort of covers a lot, and so I thought it's fairly wise to split up homelessness and housing. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap. Homelessness is fundamentally a housing issue in a lot of ways, uh, fortunately, I get to work with the other reporter who's focused exclusively on homelessness. But as you point out, um, particularly for folks who are like chronically living on the street, or there might be other issues, or certainly other policy solutions, rather than just focusing on solely as a housing issue. So
Yeah, but nobody would argue that we don't have a serious shortage of housing in California.
some people do, but yeah.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Well, speaking of arguments over housing, there was a lot of activity in the state legislature this year.
Yeah.
A bunch of bills passed, 50 plus bills around housing. Talk about a couple of the bigger ones, or the ones that you think are most interesting, most have the most impact on people, especially people looking for, hoping to be able to get a home.
Sure. Yeah. And as you mentioned, depending on how you count it, there are 50, 60, maybe more bills that passed this year and were signed by the governor that touch on housing in some way. And so we could have a very long conversation on this. I would say, just sort of as a framing exercise, like, it helps to think about housing bills sort of divided into a couple different categories. So there are the bills that focus on providing more funding, state funding for specifically affordable housing. There are bills that sort of provide protections for existing renters, in particular. Then, sort of in the last decade or so, there has been one of the biggest and sort of the most contentious package of bills that you see over and over again are bills that are focused on producing more housing, or sort of reducing the barriers to producing more housing. You often you hear this described as streamlining bills, or sort of the cutting red tape. Often these are restrictions that are imposed at the local level. And so this year, some of the biggest bills, and certainly some of the most contentious bills, were in that last category, these sort of streamlining bills, the bills that sort of try to get the state as a whole to build more housing. I'd say the highest profile one, the one that certainly got the most attention, was a bill called SB 423. I will try to limit how many sort of numbers and letters I throw out there, but that was sort of a big one. It was authored by Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco. He is certainly one of the most prolific, if not the most prolific, legislators when it comes to housing, particularly these types of bills. And essentially, it was, if the premise of this bill, which builds on and expands a prior bill that was passed in 2017, is if you build multifamily housing, so sort of small apartments, apartment buildings, that kind of thing. If you build that in an area that's already developed, so not sprawl, and you set aside a certain share for people making under a certain income, and you abide by certain labor standards, then basically you get what's called ministerial approval, meaning that there's no discretion on the part of local governments. They can't sort of hold long hearings where people come and yell at each other. There can't be any sort of environmental review that can span on for years. You just get sort of rubber stamped as long as you sort of check those boxes. And so that sounds very technical, but basically it is part of this larger push by legislators to make housing less of a discretionary process in the hands of locals, and more something that if you check the boxes and you meet the zoning requirements, then you can just go ahead. And so similarly, there was another bill, SB 4, also by Senator Scott Wiener, that had a similar process for housing, affordable housing on land owned by houses of worship, so churches and synagogues and temples and mosques and so forth, as well as nonprofit colleges. And so that kind of got, you sometimes heard this referred to as the yes in God's backyard bill, as opposed to yes in my backyard. And so that was also another big one.
So I mean, those are big steps in trying to create more, make housing happen faster, right? Let the creation of housing happen faster. I guess is it going to be a while until we know if it's actually worked? I mean, when can you tell if those things have worked, and how long does it take for something like that for housing to actually start showing up?
No, I appreciate you asking that, because often in the press we get very like fixated on this new fancy bill that's going to reduce barriers to building housing. but yeah, to your point, it takes years for cities to figure out how to implement this, and then it takes years for developers to figure out how to sort of navigate this new process. And then once you actually start building, it can take a year or two or more to actually build. And so, yeah, it does take a while. To that point, the predecessor to this bill was introduced in 2017. We didn't really start to see any new production that was using that bill or that law for at least a couple of years. And so there is a definite lag. And so when you talk about, okay, we're in a crisis, we're, clearly we just heard from someone in Santa Rosa, or, basically anywhere you live in the state, people are getting priced out, or unable to buy in if they're trying to buy, or, obviously at the bottom end, people falling into homelessness. This maybe feels a little abstract and not super helpful. So there are sort of other bills that sort of look more at sort of tenant protections, or people helping people who are already housed rather than just producing new housing. I would say it wasn't as much of a banner year for that kind of thing last year. Last year, the big focus, I would say, was on streamlining. But you do have some high profile bills, one from Assemblymember Matt Haney, also from San Francisco. Probably not a surprise that a lot of San Francisco legislators are really big on housing. But that sort of reduced the total security deposits that landlords can charge renters. So that sort of helps on the margins. You also had a bill by Senator Maria Durazo from Los Angeles that makes it a little bit harder for landlords to evict tenants for no reason, or at least for flimsy reasons. Makes it a little bit, you have to kind of justify if you're say evicting someone so that you can do work on your property. You actually have to show that you're doing work on your property, that kind of thing. And so yes, there were a handful of bills that sort of help on the margins like that, but not as big a year as sort of the earlier class of bills that I mentioned that reduce some of the barriers.
Yeah, and do we know, when you talk about limiting security deposits or limiting the reason somebody can be evicted, we did a lot of reporting during the pandemic on evictions when there was supposedly an eviction ban in place, but some people were still being evicted. How do we know if these things are working, right? Does every county now have to figure out how to take that and implement it? And then if somebody has a problem, they have to go complain to their county and hope the county or the city will do something about it. It's still really tricky to actually get relief or support or progress under these laws, right?
It's really tricky to get progress. It's really tricky to know if you're making progress. I mean, evictions, it's a legal process, and so you do have to file with the county court system, and so those are data that reporters can eventually dig up. But yeah, no, it's hard. There's not sort of an automatic sort of tell that, okay, this is actually reducing evictions. To the point of the bill that I mentioned that makes it harder for landlords to justify evicting someone, or sort of raises the bar for that. I mean, I think that was part of this sense among some legislators, and certainly among housing advocates and tenant advocates, that it's one thing to put tenant protections in place, but if you have a relationship between a landlord and a tenant, particularly a tenant who's sort of lower income, maybe they don't speak English as a first language, there's sort of an inherent imbalance there. And so even if you have protections on the books, they might not know that they exist. They might not have any easy way to enforce them. And so this particular bill was sort of a way to get at that. But I think, to your point, it's still tricky.
And a lot of it falls to tenant groups in certain areas, right? If your community has a strong tenant rights group or lawyers who help tenants or something like that, which I would guess tend to be in the bigger cities, but I don't know if that's actually true.
Yeah, I think that's probably broadly true. Although bigger cities have a lot more tenants who need things, or who need these services. You sometimes see prosecutors sort of getting involved, but yeah, for the most part, it is third party groups who are sort of helping certainly provide information to tenants, and then also representing them in cases.
There's a question here from Chloe asking if you've heard any conversation about more protection for tenants in buildings that have a low-income housing tax credit and protection specifically against rent increases or rent control on those buildings, I guess.
Yeah, perhaps she's been reading CalMatters this morning. There was a new story, not by me, but by my colleague Jeannie. He wrote this great story about the sort of absence of rent control or rent caps for buildings that that are funded through the low income housing tax credit, which is sort of the workhorse affordable housing program at the federal level. And so, we're just for some context, in 2019, the state did pass this bill that sets a cap at how much landlords can raise the rent each year. It wasn't called rent control, but I think that was more of a political reason. It's basically rent control, just kind of a soft, like it's very high ceiling on rent control. But it's sort of like 5% plus inflation or no more than 10%. But anyway, the point being that it applies to a lot of rental housing, but not all. So there were exceptions for things like single family homes. And also there was an exemption for these affordable sort of big deed restricted affordable housing projects that were funded through the low income housing tax credit. And I think, the argument for not having the rent cap on that is that there already is a sort of a rent restriction in place for those buildings, because if you're qualified through the low income housing tax credit, you have to keep it sort of affordable for lower income folks. But you do have certain situations, particularly this year, where you have landlords who are raising the rent quite a bit higher than the statutory cap to sort of bring it up to the highest they can. And that's putting a lot of pressure on folks, particularly in areas like San Jose or these really high income areas where, because the low income housing tax credit rents are set based on sort of the average income in an area. If you're living in a really rich area, but you yourself are not rich, the allowable rent could still be quite high.
It becomes much higher. Yeah. Let's talk about something coming up this fall, right? The legislature is going to put some housing related issues on the ballot that we're going to have to vote on in November.
Yeah.
And these are on the ballot because it's a lot of money, right? Billions of dollars to be spent on housing. Talk about the issues that are expected to be on the ballot and what we're going to be voting on.
Yeah, so still a work in progress. I think there was a lot of negotiations this last year where sort of a lot of people have a lot of need and are all sort of competing for scarce real estate on the ballot. But certainly we expect some kind of affordable housing bond to be put on the ballot. Those negotiations are ongoing. We already know that there is going to be a bond on the March ballot, that's the primary ballot, that is providing funding for mental health services and beds for people with psychiatric needs, which is sort of a way at sort of addressing sort of the most acute chronic homelessness issues. Obviously, it's not housing per se, but it sort of gets grouped in with that conversation sometimes. I would also say that there's a constitutional amendment that is going to be on the November ballot that will make it easier for local governments to raise money through bonds. Right now, a lot of housing bonds require 2/3 of locals to support something in order for it to pass. It would reduce it down to 55%. And so, yeah, I think you do see there's a lot of focus now, particularly after last year, where they sort of cut a lot of the red tape, that particularly on affordable housing projects. A lot of the affordable housing folks and advocates are now saying, okay, we've cut the red tape. Now we actually need some money. And particularly in this year where there's a huge budget deficit facing the state, might be looking to turn to voters to sort of provide some of that cash.
Yeah. And do you have any sense yet of what's coming up in the next legislative session? The legislature is going to reconvene right after the New Year's and start a whole new year of probably proposing hundreds, thousands of bills.
Yeah, no doubt. They never run out of ideas for bills.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that affordable housing bill bond that I mentioned that is going to be sort of being pushed to the November ballot. That's going to be part of a big discussion in January. They have to figure that out before, in time to get it onto the November ballot. Beyond that, I'll be curious to see sort of what discussions go forward now that we have had so many bills that sort of look at the streamlining side, whether that there's still that much appetite to sort of deal with that, or whether there's going to be more focus on sort of these tenant protection issues that maybe weren't considered as much. Legislators are still sort of mostly on break, but I look forward to sort of bugging them in the weeks to come to sort of see what ideas they have in mind.
Yeah, yeah. Let me remind folks that if you have a question or a comment, you want to share something or ask a question, the chat is open for you to do that. Um, we talked about how so many of the things the legislature can do or the state can do are streamlining to eventually allow more housing to be built, right? If all the things done in the past few years work really well, 10 years from now, we've got a lot more housing in the state,
Yeah.
which clearly we will need. Is there anything that the legislators could do or have talked about doing or considered and decided not to do that would have a more immediate impact? Are there ideas out there that would, during the pandemic, there were some quick things, right? Let's take some hotels and convert them to housing and that sort of thing. Are
Mhm.
things like that still being kicked around, or does it feel mostly like what policymakers can do is sort of address the long term?
Well, it's a big space. I mean, I think to your point, there are still discussions about conversions, so whether it's converting hotels or converting. I know there's a lot of focus, particularly now that you see places like downtown San Francisco sort of just emptying out from commercial space, looking at sort of converting empty office buildings into housing. Yeah, I'd say the challenges for those kinds of conversions is it also takes a while, even if you're not looking at sort of this long drawn out regulatory process. Just the actually building things or taking things out and putting them back in, that also takes a while. Um, but I would say to the extent that there's going to be discussion around affordable housing funding, that does tend to have a somewhat or could potentially have a quicker impact, because particularly on the state side, there are, I think the last I checked, the state's multifamily housing program, which is sort of the main state funded part of affordable housing, you have the number of applications for the amount of money available are sort of 10 to 1. And so there are sort of,
Yeah.
for every $1 available, there's $10 of need. And these are projects by definition that are ready to go. So if there was more funding, you'd get those things breaking ground pretty quickly. And so that's sort of a more quicker turnaround thing. And then I think, on sort of the tenant protection side, assuming that there are teeth in those laws and that they're actually enforced and people know how to follow them, if you're looking to sort of reduce evictions and that kind of thing, once those laws go in the book, they're on the book and
They're
should have an
available right away.
impact
Yeah.
effectively. Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to a developer recently who was, kind of bemoaning the fact that you can flip a hotel into residential housing somewhat more quickly, especially if it's one of those hotels or apartments that has like suites that have a kitchen in each room anyway, right? And you take an office building and think about putting housing in there. There's no plumbing in there to have, water in every unit or bathrooms. There's no wiring for kitchens. It's so much harder to conceive of taking one of those buildings that was built for one purpose and flipping it to another.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an appealing idea, particularly when you have these two major problems. We don't have enough housing, and we have, at this point, too much office space. Why don't we just take one and make it the other?
Yeah.
And I think what people realize is that, particularly when you're looking at sort of downtown core areas, when you're looking at this giant building with a huge floor plan, only windows on one side, and you realize like, oh, well, in that giant center, people have to live there. You can't have houses with absolutely no air or light. And so it gets a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, just weren't built for that.
Yeah.
Question here in the chat. The short version of the question is, do YIMBY policies work? And the explanation is, when you build more housing for middle class people, does that open up more affordability for lower income folks, right? Do we have to build low income housing specifically? Or if you could get more middle income people housed, is there a theory that that would create more space, I guess, more affordability for like what kind of housing do we have to build to really solve the problems we have?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really good point. There's a lot of folks who debate that. I think just as a matter of sort of math, if you build housing for someone who's middle income or even upper middle income, I live in Oakland, for example. You see this sort of day to day. You see maybe a fancy looking, what's called sort of a luxury apartment building going up. The people who are competing for that generally aren't just kind of emerging out of the ether. They exist. They're already living in Oakland, or they're looking to live in Oakland. And if you didn't build that housing, what would they be competing for? Well, they'd be looking at the old Victorians in West Oakland. driving up rents there. And so, yes, I think there is a fairly compelling argument that even if you're not, a lot of most housing advocates would say that obviously you need a lot of housing for lower income folks, that the market itself is arguably not going to provide as much as you need for folks who are really the bottom 20%, bottom 25% of the income spectrum. But that if you provide middle income, upper middle income housing, you are providing an escape valve for people who would otherwise be sort of competing for what would you think of as lower income housing, and sort of leading to gentrification and displacement.
Yeah, it's a tough problem.
But
Question here about tenants. Folks who are working class who can't keep up with the rent. There were certainly protections during the pandemic from evictions. What's available now? What do you do if you're working, you're living maybe in a more expensive area? The question mentions places you've lived, Santa Barbara, the Bay Area. This person's from Ventura.
yeah.
What do you do when you're in that situation and you can't afford the rent? Are there programs available? Is there anything other than go try to find someplace cheaper to live and drive farther to work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there might be local programs in place, or sort of non-government assistance in place. There's Section 8 and that kind of thing. But yeah, no, I think it raises an interesting point, which is that during the pandemic, I think the state came together and thought like, okay, we really need to ensure that during a pandemic that we don't have on top of that sort of a wave of evictions as people are losing their job or losing income as a result of that pandemic, and then sort of exacerbating the pandemic as people congregate into shelters and that kind of thing. And now that those protections are mostly gone, do we owe it to folks to sort of provide some more of those protections? And it's an ongoing debate, and I'm not sure there's sort of an easy answer there.
Yeah, yeah. Do you ever, as you've been covering this beat, you have an interesting background, right? You did a public policy degree. You've studied sort of the policy side of these things, both as a reporter and as a grad student, with some fantasy that studying public policy would get you a better job than journalism. I'm glad you came back to it. But do you ever find yourself sitting there and thinking, well, here's what they should do? Like if you were in the legislature, is there something that you'd like to see done, or you would introduce, or a path that people don't seem to be going down yet that's worth looking at?
Oh man, I mean, one of the appealing things about being a journalist is they don't have to do that, and they can just sort of sit on the side and
That's right.
people for not doing their jobs very well. No, I mean, it is inherently a really difficult problem. I mean, in California, there's a reason it's expensive here. It's like a very appealing place to live. Lots of people want to live here. You understand why people necessarily, for whatever selfish or not so selfish reasons, don't want to build housing. And affordable housing does cost an unbelievable amount of money. I mean, I think one thing I would say is that I've been sort of thinking about this a lot lately. There's so much focus in the legislature, particularly over the last few years, about building more, and particularly reducing some of the restrictions that are in place at the local level, which makes sense, because some of those restrictions have a big impact in sort of restricting the supply that I think most people agree that we do need to see. But one of the biggest restrictions on affordable housing, or housing in general, is the cost of labor. That's a much harder issue to just solve with the legislature. There is a sort of a chronic labor shortage of skilled construction workers since the Great Recession. It's not really recovered in the way that you'd kind of hope it would. And so I'm not answering your question at all, maybe purposely, but I guess the point
No,
being,
that's okay. That's okay. But you're right about the cost. You hear two things from developers, right? You hear about the cost of labor. It's expensive to build something.
right.
And the costs, and this goes back to the streamlining thing, the costs of the permits and the time you wait for permits,
Sure.
and the hoops you have to jump through, which perhaps they're streamlining. We're at about the top of the hour here. Ben, I want to thank you for taking the time. Ben Christopher, housing reporter at CalMatters. You can follow Ben's work on the website at calmatters.org. You can see in the chat there the CalMatters for Learning website, where you can find more information about housing and all the other work that the California State Library has enabled us to do. This is a great partnership we have with the library. Tremendously grateful to them for their help. And all the resources that the library has enabled are on that website at CalMatters for Learning. And with that, thanks very much, and have a great holiday season. Thanks, Ben.